Hello again, John Patrick, erstwhile professor in biochemistry and pediatrics, but for the last 25 years, basically an itinerant, hopefully stimulator of the mind, courtesy of students. And if you want to know more about that, you can listen to the more ancient podcasts. What about this week? Well, I want to start with reading a little bit from Dorothy Sayers. You know that I'm very concerned about cultural decay, and one of the things that disappears is virtue. But she says, a virtue is a settled disposition of character, a capacity to act, well-rooted in human nature, strengthened by custom, good mores, education, and above all, good examples. Piety is the virtue that enables us to do what is right in relation to our family, friends, benefactors, country, and God. It supports the general virtue of justice because it disposes us to render to each what is due. Piety underlies the virtue of justice, wrote Cicero. It is that by which we reverence our parents, other elders, our relatives, friends, benefactors, and likewise our country, which is to us another parent, and likewise God. This reverence or regard is closely allied with notions of love, charity, devotion, and holiness. That's an astonishing, actually, it's not Dorothy Sayers, it's James Hankins quoting Dorothy Sayers. But that's a wonderful description of the way cultures grow, and they don't grow quickly, and particularly those who are obsessed with the present and want everything now, instantly. It's not going to work that way. Never has, never will. And when you have utopian dreams like the Marxian one, or even the Hitlerian one, it doesn't last. There's plenty of historical records showing that, but people don't read anymore. One book a year would be the most you could expect from the average American. That's terrifying. Because those who don't have any historical background have no means to answer back, so to speak. But this week is rather interesting. The last few weeks, my birthplace, England, is having a cultural revolution of the most extraordinary kind. We all loved our country when we were growing up, but we were not very expressive about it. Even for VE Day, after the end of the Second World War, which is one of my first memories, there were plenty of flags and things around that day, but otherwise we weren't a great flag-waving crowd. But what's been happening over the last little while, particularly to working-class areas in the Midlands and the North, where some towns have been totally taken over by Muslims. I mean, one town recently had a major event in the public year, something to do with the mayor, I think, or something like that. It was all in Arabic. That's not being a good guest, and it's certainly being a stupid host. But that's where we're at. And then, a little while back, an immigrant boy, probably, almost certainly psychologically deranged, but nevertheless, he stabbed several girls and killed them, little girls, at a dance class. And one woman who'd been spent her life caring for children that age, she had her own children before that, she'd lived as a nanny, and she was married to a local politician. And she was so angry, she wrote an angry tweet in which she said, lock them up, get rid of them. The anger was apparent. But she was arrested for hate speech. It wasn't hate, because hate is something that goes on as a background to your life. She didn't have that. But then she was badly advised that the best thing to do was plead guilty, because then you'd get a shorter sentence. It was a silly thing to do. No jury would have convicted her. She spent most of a year in prison before public pressure forced them to shorten her sentence, and she's now been released. But she's talking about what happened. And people are absolutely appalled. At the same time, double standards were applying. So there are plenty of things that have been said by immigrants to the country which are hateful, not angry, but hateful, different. And they plead not guilty, and they just get a reprimand. And people don't like those double standards. And they've taken to the streets. You can watch it on YouTube if you want. It's astonishing to see thousands of people protesting against the political elite. And it's highly likely, I think, that the government will fall over these things, and we will move to a more conservative position. Americans, many of whom constitute the majority of people watching this podcast, they don't really appreciate how wonderful their constitution is and the way that it has made country central. Very patriotic in the modern world, but little discussion of where it came from and how it came about. But there's a growing hunger across the board. We need to think more carefully about what we're really about and what works properly and what doesn't. And that description of how virtue works is a lovely one. And it gives you that sense that you need to grow into a narrative of meaning. And the young are lacking meaning. We have a young man who arrived in our house yesterday. He'd driven all the way from Oklahoma to visit us just for a few days so that he could talk books and talk generally. He was telling me last night that I don't remember, but he came with his father to a summer conference at Augustine College, good many years ago now. And it lasted a week, and on Saturday morning, those that could stay would come and spend the day with us, and then we'd end with a nice meal, and everybody would go back home. So he spent a day at our farm, and I apparently took him round my library and picked out one or two books that he might be interested in. And he hadn't come across such books before, and it had a profound impact on him. So now we're talking about books in relation to the fact that he's got a 5-year-old son, and he's kind, he cares about the poor, and doesn't know how to put that caring into practice. He will find a way, of course. Our world is in trouble because things that should have been talked about aren't talked about, even in church congregations. And as for the secular woke world, it's forced on us as kind of fuzzy speech, primarily defined not to communicate, but not to upset. That's not the basis for a society. And what's happening in England is the argument that you must have freedom of speech. You need to have that in America too, and you're having it, fortunately. You're not alone. It's happening throughout the Western world at the moment. And what's really interesting to me is that it is young men who are leading the way in some respects. They're going back to church in really significant numbers. This Sunday, as I came out of church, there were two young men I hadn't seen before were there, and I just said hello, and we started talking. And one was actually visiting the other. They'd been friends for years, and they go to church together when they meet. He's Orthodox, but in an Anglican church he can take communion, and so he's happy to come along. And they're both at the stage of master's degrees. And we talked about how education was not as fulfilling as it might be. And that's the reason they go back to church. They're looking for that depth of understanding that Hankins describes so so well. And you can find it elsewhere too. I mean, you don't have to look far. Going right back to the iconic Closing of the American Mind, and secular Jew Alan Bloom nevertheless understood that his grandparents inhabited a story of meaning which his cousins didn't have, although they were extremely successful. I also came across this week. It will need a little explanation, but I'll read first and try and hang in. It's a dozen lines or so, and it was written some time ago by a man called Terry Eagleton, who was a Marxist in the English department, of course. Marxism flourished in English departments in England back, this would be 20 years ago. But he then wrote a book on cultural criticism, which made him very wealthy. So although he was a Marxist, he was happy to take the benefits of capitalism. But this is what he wrote about the whole enterprise of theory-driven learning, which is what your children are being subjected to. The woke theory of being is a theory, untested, and then as far as it's been tested, it's disastrous. But this is what he wrote. Cultural theory, as we have it, promises to grapple with some fundamental problems, but on the whole, it fails to deliver. This is a lovely streak of honesty. It has been shamefaced about morality and metaphysics, embarrassed about love, biology, religion, and revolution, largely silent about evil, reticent about death and suffering, dogmatic about essences, universals, and foundations, and superficial about truth, objectivity, and disinterestedness. This is, on any estimate, a rather large slice of human existence to fall down on. As he proceeded through his academic life, he has been honest but not consistent. There's somebody most people would not want to argue with because he's very widely read, but nevertheless can't put it all together in a way that makes sense. He could see the problems. I mean, he had one of the best put-downs of Dawkins I ever came across. He commented on one of his books. He said, Dawkins talking about theology is rather like listening to someone who's only read the book of British birds talking about theology. He doesn't know what he's talking about, was his basic point. A rich literature reduced to a huge ability with words. I mean, the selfish gene, it sells itself, although it's utter nonsense. The gene is neither selfish nor unselfish. It doesn't think. This gene is merely a page from a library book, if you like, or the most amazing library that's ever been invented in terms of keeping itself in order and controlled and knowing where the books are, so to speak. But DNA doesn't do anything. It provides the information whereby the rest of the machinery of the cell can function in the most extraordinary ways. We're living in a world of technological expertise going through the roof. And as he says, no metaphysics at all. The way I put it is to say the modern young person in university has been spiritually lobotomized. They've had that bit of their mind which should be dominant. Those who are listening, please forgive my incompetence with my fingers. I have a tremor, and that on a computer is disastrous at times. Not quite as bad as my good friend from Boston, who says, my computer eats my work. I have that experience occasionally, but I'm assured that this is still recording properly. So back to the screen. What Eagleton and Hankins and Dorothy Sayers and indeed Lewis and many others were seeing is this lack of any basis for saying should and ought, but without a whole network of ways of being that we don't think about, but nevertheless operate in our lives, courtesies that flow from deeply important theology, actually. You can't go from one culture to another and just jump in and demand what you want, which is what most of the immigrants are doing now. They come for things, but they have no sense of commitment to the culture that produced those things. And because we don't teach history in the way we should, I mean, once the feminists took over, they were not going to teach a history that showed that it was men who did most things, women who made it possible. That's the proper way to teach it. Men without women are dangerous. Women in charge, there's a problem. And many of the best of them are now saying that very clearly. And I think there's a real movement afoot. And of course, the fact that those who inhabit this story and buy into it are not averse to having children like the modern feminists are. So our family, which is traditional in these senses, is now past 50. From 2 to 50 is rather nice. And yesterday, several of them were visiting. And the conversations are, for me, beautiful. They are so unlike anything you see in the media's presentation of our modern society. The love of things said well, said beautifully, that are important existentially, that doesn't happen, but it should, and we've got to do something about that. So the young man I was talking about, we've already been wandering through little bits of Tolkien. We both love The Lord of the Rings, which our world, in making a very popular film, Jackson, nevertheless, in my view, missed one of the most important scenes in the whole book, where Aragorn says to Eomer, good and evil are not one thing amongst dwarves and elves and another amongst men, and it is a man's part to discern them. Discerning what you ought to do, regardless of your own safety. Those episodes that litter our history, bravery beyond imagination, so often, that needs to be part of reality, and it must be true. I mean, the big problem that's facing Islam at the moment is that it's facing its 19th century, it's facing the equivalent to the 19th century intellectual attack on Christianity, which forced it to raise its standards, and it's come through and is flourishing, particularly in the most serious parts of the church. Really committed sacramental Christianity of Orthodox and Catholic variety, and the biblical Christianity of the evangelicals. That's where the church is growing dramatically, because it's answering the big questions. Those two young men, as I met on the church steps, they said, there's no discussion. They're both doing engineering, and of course, engineering, you want it to be ethical, don't you? And they are amongst the most conservative people in the university. They're not going to say that doing things right is up to you. They have standards as to what has to be done in order to know this building will stand up or this machine will work. Fixing things so they work that way is something that is inbuilt very early to little boys. They like making things work. An animistic culture with no big picture, that creativity is present in their children. I remember years ago we were in Africa and there was a visit by the Swiss helicopter mission, because the area we worked in, the Utopian mountains, were the backdrop, and getting there were no roads, and they came and moved some things to churches up in the mountains by helicopter. And it was the big event forever, so to speak. But what was really interesting to me in the next few weeks, little boys from the sort of 6 to 9-year-olds, that sort of age group, with the dominant ones, were building little models of the helicopter as they saw it out of what was lying around, sticks and leaves and bits of wire, and they made some remarkable novels. They were trying to fix things. We had a driver, Abdallah, who had no significant engineering training, but he could take a vehicle apart and put it back together again on the side of the road. And I saw him do that for a change of rear bearing in the middle of nowhere, using only carefully chosen soft rocks, a hammer and a tire lever without stripping a thread. It was amazing to watch. That capacity to fix and do things is present. It's a gift that we have. Coming out of Eden, the man was told, you're going to have to work to provide for your family and to fix things. And the woman was told, and they do it immediately, don't they? You only have to see the difference between female medical students having a baby in their hands for the first time and males. It's different. We've been in denial of our real roles. Now, when you use a tool for the wrong reason, you wreck the tool. You don't get the same outcome just because you modified it to try and do that. You watch what's happening. I watch what's happening in a family, and fortunately, they all take the view that we'll trust God with our fertility, and the trust has led to our now 6 great-grandchildren and 22 grandchildren that we've watched. This is wonderful. And at the end of your life, which is where we're getting to, what comes up are the stories that you had along the way. I mean, all my children will sit down and talk about the experience of growing up in Jamaica and then going to Africa every summer for a few years. It changed the way they look at the world in a very good way. What we're looking for in the world around us, I mean, it is a disaster when young people are lost. And that's the only thing you can say about many of the crimes that are going on, and the sense of entitlement instead of the sense of privilege and duty. It's astonishing that we could allow this to happen and that the church could allow it to happen. Sunday school, for instance, has been dumbed down to basically a playgroup and sort of dumb art, whereas what's really needed is to give the children the stories that can give their life meaning. They are made for story, for narrative. And so wise cultures make that the center of early childhood activity in the church. A good friend of mine, now deceased, grew up as an Orthodox Jew, ended up as a Reformed Presbyterian minister, converted in Holland when somebody gave him a Bible, a New Testament, and for the first time he read the crucifixion and realized that was why Orthodox Jews don't like reading Isaiah 53, and it was enough to bring him to faith. But he was a wonderful preacher, especially of the Old Testament, but he ran a church on his own, and so his wife was teaching Sunday school and he was teaching an adult group at the same time, and people kept coming to him and saying, your wife's a better teacher than you are, because they knew he was a very good teacher, and he rather liked the fact that he was a very good teacher. But eventually he got an assistant so he could go and look through the keyhole, so to speak, at what his wife was doing. And she had children sitting around her in tears sometimes, and all she was doing was reading the Bible to them with her presentation of it. She eventually had several books published of commentaries on the first 5 books of the Bible for children. Nancy Gans, if you're interested, Shepherd Press, I think, will find it. He was astonished. But that, looking through the keyhole, children in tears, and all she had for material was the Bible with her way of expressing it, which eventually got published as a commentary. Children love stories. My wife is a brilliant reader of stories to children, and just recently we had an email from one of our granddaughters saying how much she looked back with pleasure on afternoons when they came to the farm and played around on the farm and then cuddled up to Sally and she read, and they would listen to her literally for hours. And of course, those of you with young children know they like books they already know, don't they? If you don't believe me, just try this. I mean, my grandchildren were wise enough, by and large, to ask Sally to read to them. But occasionally she was busy and they'd ask me. And so they'd bring me a book that I'd read many times before and was bored by it. So I would try and shorten it. They wouldn't allow that. Grandad, you're missing bits out. They'd brought me a book they knew every word of. So what need were they meeting? There was something important going on in hearing those stories from me. Wow. That's what God does to us when he made us in his image, male and female, created he, us. We were given tasks, and the Jews spent centuries working their way through this. And Orthodox Jews know that it's Father's job to see that his children know all the stories of the Old Testament. And that gives them that background that Hankins described so clearly in my quotation. We're missing out on that. We didn't do as good a job as we should have done with our children. Our children and our grandchildren, some of our grandchildren are doing spectacularly well with this. They've taken the message on board, particularly those who spent time in Africa, where they realized that when somebody came to fix the vehicles, Daniel and Patrick learned from them, but no one on the indigenous local people had that inclination, because they just accept life as it comes, because that's what animistic paganism does. It's fatalistic, it's accepting, but it's not a basis on which you can flourish. God made it very clear when he introduced the Jews, after giving them many centuries of realizing they're going their own way, led to trouble. It took centuries to get them to the point where they were willing actually to begin to try and do what he wanted. One of the key verses of Deuteronomy, you shall not do what is right in your own eyes. Wow. You couldn't put it more bluntly than that, could you? And what you shall do is teach these divine rules, these divine legitimate intolerances, I like to call them. And then you can flourish. But if you fail, you will fail. They are the reason the Jews could survive the Holocaust. Nobody else would have survived the Holocaust. But they'd been through it many times before, and they know why we depart and we are punished and we come back. They have a unique history in that way. And instead of being anti-Semitic, we should say, why do they succeed? I was just listening to a Palestinian journalist who went back, and she asked a brilliant question of a Palestinian woman. She said, tell me, who are the most famous Palestinians of the last 50 years? And the woman couldn't come up with a name of somebody who was genuinely famous for good reason. The Jews have a long history, which they didn't share with us as well as they could have done. But that's what makes them who they are. Anti-Semitism is just, as far as I can see, it's just envy. The Muslims have hardly won a Nobel Prize, and certainly none that I'm aware of at the high level of science. You get Nobel Prizes in areas of opinion and the like, but hard science requires certain habits of mind which Islam doesn't give. And Islam, is going back to where I was quite a while ago, in the 19th century, Christianity was attacked by German scholars and others, denigrating the scriptures. And we've gone through it now, and we've come out the other end, and real scholarship of the scriptures is proving to be a perfectly good academic exercise, and it changes people's lives for the better. But the Muslims are now facing something which they'd never expected. They were told that the Quran came down from heaven in its word perfect. We now know there are tens of thousands of variations in the Qurans that we can find, and there's no evidence that anything was written down till 200 years after the alleged time of Muhammad, who may well be a composite figure. Certainly the Quran was put together by the ruling family, under the aegis of the ruling family, who realized that now they had an empire, they needed a common religion. And he had his troops in one part fighting with troops from another, and they began fighting with one another over the Quran. They had different versions. So he ordered that they collect them all together and they decide which is the best one and get rid of the rest. But of course people didn't, and they're now being discovered. So no, one of their central tenets is absolutely not true. The Quran was not preserved, word perfect, and they have to come to terms with that. Whether they will or not remains to be seen. But if they don't, I mean, their best people who have that streak of intellectual honesty in them are going to walk away for that reason. And the hadiths are written many centuries after the time when Muhammad was supposed to be flourishing. The Kaaba was never visited by Abraham for all sorts of very obvious reasons. And there are lots of other places like the Kaaba, and they were places of pagan worship. Now, you have to come to terms with these things. Christianity took in ideas from elsewhere along the way. That always happens. So, we need to go back to serious reading and serious discussion of how we should talk about the history of culture. My understanding of how to go about this from the Bible was dramatically changed around 2000. There was a graduate student conference in Chicago, and the two main speakers were N.T. Wright and Dallas Willard, and it was an astonishingly good conference, and it went on for an extra day because Chicago had the biggest snowstorm they'd had in years and years. Everything was snowed up. The airports were closed. So the hotel said, no, none of our guests can get here, so you may as well stay on for another day. And we did. That became a book, and I'm just rereading it at the moment. And it's really very satisfying as Tom Wright takes you through the pursuit of what we know about Jesus and what we can say that is honest about that, much more than you would think at first sight. So I came away from that with a desire to read more critically, more seriously than I'd done before, and not to be afraid of doing that. When we get things wrong, which in science we do all the way, I mean, theories are finite. They last as long as they are the best explanation, and then they die. I mean, Newton's explanation, he was a Christian man, and he said, look, I don't pretend to have described reality. What I've done mathematically is give us a better means of understanding reality as we currently know it. He was humble enough to be aware that it's quite likely that his explanation would not be perfect. And of course, when Einstein came along, it changed. That's the beauty of science. It's not written in stone. It's written in sand. How often that metaphor is misused. But science is provisional always. I mean, there got to be some things that are pretty permanent, but just when we think we've got it all nailed down, as we thought we'd got physics nailed down at the beginning of the 20th century, and along comes Einstein and everything changes. Gives us, that's where the word paradigm comes from, the paradigm shift, which was coined at that time to deal with that problem. And paradigm shifts occur in science all the while. When I started medical school, we had a disease called mucoviscidosis, and the children lived at best a few months. We would now call it cystic fibrosis. All we knew at that time is they had salty sweat to begin with, and they had terrible infections and other problems which we didn't cope with. Now, we have the gene, we know how it works, we know the major problem is a little disordered gait on a chloride pathway, a zinc gait, and we've got better over the years at caring for these kids. So now people with cystic fibrosis are getting their old age pension. We've learned, of course, there are variants in that gene. We start with one gene, and then you realize all the little modifications around it alter the nature of how that gene is expressed. So I've watched that process for that disease from, a fatal disease in a few weeks to old age pension in one lifetime. That's amazing. But I mean, when I went to medical school, we had one antibiotic, or two, perhaps. Churchill was lucky to survive. He didn't even get an antibiotic. He got the sulfur drug, which was preceded the antibiotics. Penicillin saved lots of lives in the Second World War, but it never had a formal trial. That's another story which I could tell, but this is not the moment. What I'm trying to get you interested in is wanting to read more and more about your own cultural history. For Americans, you won't read de Tocqueville, but you could read Harvey Mansfield's introduction to de Tocqueville in a very short history of series from Oxford University Press. Brilliant. Americans are so privileged that their nation began as a Protestant nation, and that was good too, because it wasn't hierarchical. If it had been Catholic, it would have been more like South America, probably. But the people who founded America were Protestants, and serious ones, and they knew that micromanagement, like modern governments go for, like Lucy Connolly has suffered from in England, it could not be done. And of course, micromanagement destroys governments. So their constitution had one major objective: to come up with a rule of law that would also prevent the abuse of power. With those constitutional principles, people had to work it out a long way off. No roads, no railways, a huge continent, congregational churches were the way it works. And America still operates in that way, as Chesterton beautifully put it. America is a country with the soul of a church. They're by far and away the most charitable country that I know, in such an open and friendly way. And I have benefited from it hugely. And I think we do a great disservice not to realize we're all fallen sinners. We're all going to screw up with monotonous regularity. But the key is, can you admit it and can you deal with it? And we've got worse and worse at that. So I've wandered around as usual. I haven't done lots of the things I put down, but I've probably done enough for one day. And I would like some feedback. Bless you all.